Good morning. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, good morning, sir. I can hear you clearly. Is that clear on your side as well?
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Certainly, sir. I am Priya and I have 4.5 years of experience as a MERN Stack Developer. Over these years, I have worked extensively with React, Node.js, Express, and MongoDB, building various web applications. I have also had the opportunity to lead small teams and mentor junior developers, which I found very rewarding. Currently, I am looking for a new challenge where I can leverage my skills to contribute to a dynamic team. That's a brief summary. Is there anything specific you would like to know further?
Okay, Priya. Can you explain your current project?
In my current project, I am part of a team that's developing a collaborative platform for remote teams. My main role has been building the real time chat functionality using Socket.io with Node.js and managing the user data in MongoDB. I've also been responsible for optimizing the API performance to handle increased user traffic. Is there anything specific you'd like to know further?
Okay. So you are working on both front end and back end, right?
Yes, exactly, sir. I work across the full stack, handling both the front end development using React and the back end systems with Node.js. Is there a specific area of development you'd like to focus on next?
Yes. Let's start with React. Can you explain difference between state and props?
Sure, sir. Props are basically like arguments passed to a component, sort of like parameters to a function. They allow data to be passed from parent components down to children, and they're usually immutable, meaning a component can't change the props it receives. State, on the other hand, is managed and owned by that specific component itself. It holds data that can change over time, and when the state changes, the component re-renders to update the UI. Does that make the distinction clearer?
Yes. So what is the use effect and where you use it in your project?
The use effect hook lets you handle side effects in your functional components, things like fetching data, setting up subscriptions, or manually updating the DOM. In my project, I've used it to fetch messages from the chat server when the chat room component mounts, and also to connect to the socket.io instance. Does that give you a better picture?
Yes. What is the difference between use memo and use callback?
Both are for performance optimization, but do slightly different things. Use memo caches the result of a calculation, only recomputing when its dependencies change. Use callback caches the function instance itself, so that a function isn't recreated on every render unless it needs to be. Does that clarify the difference?
Good. Suppose your React application is slow. How will you optimize it?
Well, first I'd start by profiling the application using the React developer tools to see exactly where the bottlenecks are. Then common techniques include looking for unnecessary re-renders and using use memo or use callback where appropriate. I'd also check for large data sets and maybe implement virtualization or lazy loading for lists and images. Code splitting with React Lazy can also help with initial load times. Are there any specific areas of the app that seem particularly slow?
Okay, so that's a great example. We will go in JavaScript. What is the closure in JavaScript?
A closure in JavaScript is when a function remembers the variables from its surrounding scope, even after that scope has finished running. Technically, every function in JavaScript is a closure because it has access to the global scope, but it's most obvious when you define a function inside another function. Have you encountered a scenario where you think you might need to use one?
No. Let's go further. What is the hoisting?
Hoisting is JavaScript's behavior of moving declarations to the top of their scope before execution. This means you can use variables and functions before they're declared in your code. Though variables are only partially hoisted, their initialization isn't. Would you like to see a specific example of how that works?
No. Let's go with next question. What is the difference between where, let, and const?
Var was the traditional way to declare variables. It has function scope and is hoisted. Let and const were introduced later to fix some of those issues. They have block scope, which is often more predictable, and they aren't hoisted partially like var. Const must be assigned a value at declaration, and that value can't be reassigned, while let allows you to change the value later. Does that clarify things?
Yes, and now could you please explain me what is the difference between promise and async await?
Async await is built on top of promises. A promise represents a value that might not be available yet, but will be resolved in the future, handling asynchronous code with then and catch. Async await lets you write asynchronous code that looks more like synchronous code, using the await keyword to pause execution until a promise settles, which can make it easier to read and reason about. Does that make sense?
Yes, using okay. Can you explain event loop in simple term?
Think of the event loop like a constantly running manager. It keeps checking the callback queue, and whenever it finds a task that's ready, it sends it to the main thread to be executed. This way, Node can keep handling one request after the other without getting stuck waiting for long tasks. Does that make it simpler?
Yes. How do you handle the authentication?
There are several ways to handle authentication. A common method is using JSON Web Tokens or JWTs. After a user successfully logs in with their credentials, the server creates a token that the client can then store and send along with future requests to access protected resources. Another approach is using session-based authentication, where the server creates a session ID and stores it on its end, sending that ID to the client for reference. Are you interested in comparing these methods?
Yes, great answer, Priya. Let's discuss some scenario-based question. So, suppose one API suddenly become very slow in production. How will you debug it?
First, I'd check our monitoring tools for any spikes in traffic or server load. Then I'd analyze the logs specifically for that slow API endpoint, looking for error messages or unusually long execution times. Profiling the code to see which part of the logic, whether it's database queries or external API calls, is taking the most time would be next. If it's a database issue, checking for missing indexes or inefficient queries would be crucial. What kind of monitoring setup do you typically have in place?
What if query is already optimized?
If the query itself is optimized, I'd look at external factors like network latency to the database server or potential throttling from third-party APIs that might depend on. It's also possible there's a resource contention on the Node.js server, so checking memory and CPU usage could be next. Is there any specific information available about the environment where it's running?
No. Okay. So, how would you handle 1 lakh concurrent users?
Requires a distributed system. I'd start by putting a load balancer in front to distribute requests across multiple Node.js instances. We'd need to use the horizontal scaling and definitely implement caching for frequent database queries.
Okay.
Using
So, what caching mechanism have you used?
only worked with Redis for caching. It's an in-memory data store, so it's extremely fast for storing frequently accessed data like API responses or query results, which can significantly reduce the load on your database. Are you thinking of a particular caching scenario?
That's a great answer. Let's discuss one more thing. What was the most difficult bug you solved?
Hardest bugs I dealt with was a memory leak in production that would cause the Node.js server to crash randomly after several days. It was tough to track down because the growth was so slow and insidious. I eventually used memory profiling tools to snapshot the heap at different times, which helped me isolate the specific piece of code that was repeatedly creating objects and not releasing them for garbage collection. It turned out to be an issue with an incorrectly configured database connection pool, where connections were not being properly returned, slowly exhausting the server's memory. Finding and fixing that was a real breakthrough that improved the stability of the entire system. Is there anything specific about the debugging process you'd equal to know?
No, it's a great answer. Like you really fixed that. Great. How do you handle the production tracer?
Production pressure by focusing on preparation and staying calm. Having good monitoring and logging systems in place helps me react quickly, but proactive measures like thorough testing and code reviews prevent many issues from happening to begin with. When a crisis does hit, I make sure to assess the situation first and prioritize fixing the main problem before diving into the details. Is there a specific type of pressure you're thinking about?
No, it's done from my side, Priya. So, do you have any question for me?
Yes, sir, I do. Could you tell me a bit more about the specific team I'd be joining and what the current projects or challenges are? Also, what would success look like for someone in this role in the first few months? Thank you for your time today.